Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another instalment of Revisiting, where I look back on one particular album. And for this instalment, we're going to look at Venus and Mars by Wings. And the reason I'm looking at this is because I've just been reading, well, I am reading, in the process of reading the second volume of the McCartney Legacy by Allan, Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair. If you don't know about this book already, it's actually a series of books. The first one came out maybe last year, and this is the second volume, the most detailed ever look at McCartney's solo career. This one goes from just after the release of Band on the Run in 1974 all the way through to, or 73, 74, all the way through to the Japanese drug bust in 1980. So I've been reading all about the recording of Venus and Mars, some of which I knew already, some of which I didn't know. Extremely interesting. If you're a Paul fan, a Wings fan like I am, obviously this history has never really been told in as much detail as this anyway. So I thought, let's do the video now while it's all fresh in my mind. I'm not going to get too much into that history because there's so much of it. But Venus and Mars, you know, was clearly the sequel to Band on the Run, and that had been a big hit album for Paul McCartney. And I think he went into this one very consciously wanting to outdo himself. There was this thing in the Beatles days where each album got better, and it was always important to try and improve on what you'd done before, and the pressure was on because Band on the Run had been such an important album for Paul, and a very cohesive artistic statement, and it had a certain atmosphere to it. The tracks had a certain sound, and of course it was very commercially successful. Whether he succeeded with Venus and Mars, I guess we'll get into that as we go. But I think the packaging is really nice. Not as distinctive, I don't think, as Band on the Run, but it was done by Hypnosis again, based on a cover idea by Linda, the photograph of the two billiard balls, red for Mars, yellow for Venus. And I know there was some talk for years and years about it being symbolic of Paul and Linda's relationship. Apparently that was completely inadvertent. Paul wrote the song Venus and Mars really based on a science fiction novel he'd been reading. I think he'd been reading some Asimov paperbacks, and his head was in that space, that kind of sci-fi kind of space. And then later on, I think he kind of attached himself to the idea of Venus and Mars almost as being a kind of personification, you know, him and Linda. But yeah, I think a really, really nice cover, and I like the lettering. I think, you know, it's just a really fun cover. I love the inside shot of them in the Mojave Desert. And one thing I'd never noticed before actually was there's actually a red ball and a yellow ball there in the sand. That's quite good fun. So that's really, really nice. A couple of posters came with the record. One of them is rather boring. I won't show you the boring one. There's quite a nice one of Paul and Linda in New Orleans, which of course is where the album was recorded. This is them at the Mardi Gras. So that's really nice. And just a quick look at the record. It's on the Capitol label, and again you've got the red and the yellow snooker balls there as part of that motif. So this album was recorded by the new version of Wings essentially, but there'd been a sort of interim version of Wings. After Band on the Run, Paul and Linda auditioned a load of drummers, and they hired this guy called Jeff Britton, who was a bit of a karate freak. He was a good drummer, he was quite solid, but he didn't last very long. They did the Junior's Farm single with him. That's when they went out to Nashville in the sort of spring, early summer of 1974. Had a bit of a hairy time out there, recording in a garage, staying on a ranch. They had quite a good time, but by this point they had Jimmy McCulloch in the band, the young Glaswegian guitarist, and he was a bit of a hellraiser, and, you know, he and Denny got up to no good, and, you know, all sorts of things happened out on the farm. But they recorded this single, Junior's Farm, came back to England, did the One Hand Clapping documentary Abbey Road, where Paul hired a director just to film some band performances, and it was to try and get the band to gel, and that was good actually. That was actually, you know, I think in fact that has come out on a record recently, the One Hand Clapping, and, you know, people have been surprised at how good that band was. But when they shifted camp to New Orleans at the end of 1974, Jeff Britton didn't last very long. Really interesting to read about the story of what happened. He is on the album. He ended up playing on a couple of tracks. I think he's on... well, he played originally on Rock Show, but I don't think his performance actually ended up on the finished record. Loving Song, and we'll talk about his contribution to that in a little while. He plays on Letting Go as well. A really nice groove on Letting Go, based on a sort of Al Green kind of sound. But the song that ended up with Jeff having to leave the band, or be sacked essentially, was Spirits of Ancient Egypt on side 2, the song that Denny Laine was given to sing. Not a great song, possibly the worst song on the album actually, but Jeff Britton wasn't able to get a good drum part going, and he was just let go in a really, ruthless act really on the part of Paul and Linda. Almost frog marched him out of the hotel in a way. It was done really brutally, and the replacement guy, Joe English, who was an American drummer, I think he was known to Tony Dorsey, who was the arranger on this album. Tony Dorsey just went through his address book and found a guy that was free and available, and it was Joe English, and he came out to New Orleans, and the first track he played on was Spirits of Ancient Egypt. He'd never heard the song before, he'd never met the McCartneys before, he didn't know Denny, he didn't know Jimmy McCulloch. He just had to immediately, sit down at the drum set and start playing these songs. What an amazing experience that would have been. But he gelled, and then that was the band that was going to go on to record the rest of this album, and then also the next 2 albums, really, or at least the next 1.5 albums. And of course it was the band that was going to go on and do the huge Wings Over America tour as well. So Venus and Mars was the record really where that particular configuration of Wings really solidified, and it was a really big production. I think what McCartney probably aimed to do with this record was to think big in terms of production. Maybe that was his insecurity a little bit, maybe, because Band on the Run had been quite a stripped down recording in a way, just him, Linda and Denny overdubbing, but now he had a full band, and he's bringing in other musicians, he's bringing in a horn section, he's recording in New Orleans, so he's got Allan Toussaint on the tracks, although I think he was mixed out in the end. He played some piano on Rock Show, but that ended up being missed out. But Allan Toussaint, an absolutely classic New Orleans producer and writer. Dave Mason, guest on this record, playing guitar on Listen to What the Man Said, and Tom Scott, who'd played with George Harrison already, was brought in to play saxophone, plays an amazing saxophone part on Listen to What the Man Said. It was completely impromptu. He was just warming up in the studio, and they played the track back and said, yeah, that's it, job done, well done. And he was like, I was just warming up. Great story. But yeah, so lots of musicians, lots of fun, recording in New Orleans, but Paul didn't really allow much of the New Orleans flavour to enter into the tracks. They did do a couple of off-cut, B-sides. There was My Carnival and Odd Socks Lunchbox, or Lunchbox Odd Socks. Those tracks had more of a sort of New Orleans-y, Mardi Gras kind of vibe, but it was very subtle on the album, not really any particular sense of New Orleans coming through, but maybe a slight jazziness, a slightly ornamental kind of sound. The production is maybe a little bit overdone on this record. I know John Heaton always says that if you want to hear the proper great versions of some of these songs, then you go to Wings Over America, the live album, which came out the following year, because the tracks are much more rocking, they're kind of much more raw, much more visceral. I think maybe McCartney went too far into the realm of production on this record in certain respects. He was working with a new engineer, a guy called Allan O'Duffy. I think he worked with McCartney very closely, and they tried to build quite a controlled studio sound, but it was maybe a little bit over-embellished at times, and it didn't really have that kind of slightly visceral sound that Band on the Run had. And then in terms of the material, I think, this album does have its fans. I know there are some people who prefer it to Band on the Run because it has a kind of more widescreen, panoramic kind of sound, in a way, it has a more live sound, although, as I said, you've got this overproduction thing going on. But I think material-wise, in general, this is a weaker album than Band on the Run. So, for example, the final song on side 1, Letting Go, it is a really good sort of bluesy rocker, but it's a little bit anonymous. It doesn't really have what Let Me Roll It had, which is a song at the end of side one of Band on the Run that had a very, very distinctive sonic environment going on, and a really interesting hook and just a very visceral sound, you know, whereas Letting Go, maybe a bit more generic. That word, maybe you could apply that word to lots of the tracks on this album. A little bit less characterful, sort of heading more into kind of mid-1970s arena rock, quite deliberately so, I think. I think the album was designed essentially to be a record that could be taken on the road, and it was going to sound like a live band again. It was very much Paul rebuilding the band and making a band album. But as I said, you know, I think the material in general is kind of weaker. Having said that, there are some really lovely moments. The album starts with the acoustic track Venus and Mars, which is an absolutely beautiful melody, very haunting, inspired by Paul reading, I think it was an Asimov book. He'd been reading some sci-fi literature. In fact, he even briefly collaborated on a kind of script idea with Asimov, but that didn't lead anywhere. And then that goes into Rock Show, which is a track that was really laboured over. They tried it with Jeff Britton in Abbey Road, hadn't really worked out. And even with Joe English, it wasn't really working. And apparently what happened was, finally, they were doing a mix in the studio, or trying to mix it. And Jimmy McCulloch just went through and sat on the drums. He was absolutely pissed out of his brain and started thumping out a really aggressive drum beat. And Paul was like, "Quick, run the tape!" And that's the version that you hear on this record. It's a bit of a mess. It's not really focused enough. It's not rocking enough. Having said that, there are some really nice parts to it. You know, it's a song that, again, it's a kind of homage to 1970s American arena rock. I do quite like the lyric. What's that man holding in his hand? He looks like a guy I knew way back when. If there's a rock show at the Concert Gabot, they got long hair at the Madison Square. You've got rock and roll at the Hollywood Bowl. We'll be there. Oh, yeah. I like all the bells in it. It's kind of like tubular bells or some kind of bell-like instrument, which is really good. And I love the breakdown towards the end with I think it is the Allan Toussaint piano at the end, going into that final section. But again, not as distinctive a song probably as Band on the Run, and the live version certainly on Wings Over America is much stronger. But then Loving Song, the next song, which is the one that Jeff Britton played on, I think is an absolutely beautiful McCartney song with an incredibly haunting melody. Great keyboard playing from Linda, some wonderful orchestrations. The orchestrations on this record were not done by Tony Visconti because they'd had a bit of a falling out on the Band on the Run album because Tony was not credited. So it was Tony Dorsey doing the arrangements this time. But he does some really, really great arrangements, really sweeping, really majestic. And Loving Song, I think it is one of McCartney's best songs. I honestly think, you know, it's as good as anything that I've heard him do. And you know, it's always been a favourite of mine. I just love the lyric, "Happiness in the Homeland." Beautiful. Then you Gave Me the Answer, which is a track which has grown on me over the years. It's definitely Paul in his kind of musical vaudeville kind of sound. You know, think of Honey Pie from the White Album, and it's got that sort of period feel to it, the kind of Fred Astaire thing. Sort of like what Freddie Mercury was doing on Night at the Opera, around about the same time, actually, you know. I think it's a fun track. It was never going to be a song that brought Paul much cred, really, you know, rock and roll credibility. That vaudeville side that he had to him was always going to be a problem in terms of his cred. But I think it's a fun song, and I think it's done quite well. It's quite nicely arranged. Magneto Entertainium Man, which is a very intricate song. It's a sort of pulsing, propulsive little pop song, really, all about comic book characters, taken from the Marvel comics. I think Stan Lee was quite pleased with the track. But yeah, it's a song I sort of blow hot and cold on. The live version is better. It's faster. It's more rocking sounding. The lyric is a little bit silly. I never quite understood this thing about, you know, we went to town with the library. I never quite understood that line. It just seemed a bit forced. There's some really nice vocal arrangements on it, though. Really, really intricate vocal arrangements. And I should just say, this is the album Well, I think Band on the Run is the album where the great Wings harmony vocals really started to happen. And when I say the Wings harmony vocals, I mean Paul, Linda and Denny Laine. But there are some great examples on this record of their harmony singing. And Linda does some tremendous stuff on Letting Go. Her backing vocals on that are absolutely fantastic. And if you think back to just a few years before, you know, she was doing some very hesitant kind of singing. Think of, you know, I Am Your Singer and Wildlife, you know, a little bit out of tune, not quite convincing enough. I mean, here she's sort of buried in production and reverb and God knows what else, so that might be hiding a multitude of sins, but it still sounds really good, that vocal sound. They've really got it together. And I think Letting Go is a decent track. You know, as I said, it's got a bit of an Al Green groove to it, nice horn section, good guitar. Just not as distinctive as Let Me Roll It. Side 2, you have the Venus and Mars reprise, which is more explicitly science fiction-y. It's got more of a sci-fi lyric. Standing in the hall of the great cathedral, waiting for the transport to come. Starship 21ZNA9. A good friend of mine studies the stars. Venus and Mars are all right tonight. And then we go into what is the weakest song on the album, I think, Spirits of Ancient Egypt, which musically actually is quite good. It's quite Pink Floydy. It's quite psychedelic. It's got some really, really interesting guitar textures in it. Denny Laine does a decent vocal. It's just that the lyrics are just so crap. You know, you're my baby and I love you. You can take a pound of love and cook it in the stew. It's just full of non sequiturs, really. It doesn't really work, that kind of big sort of majestic chorus, Spirits of Ancient Egypt, Shadows of Ancient Rome, but it just, this You're My Baby, I know, you could sell an elevator to Geronimo. It's just cringeworthy, it's weak, you know. It's a shame because musically it's an interesting song. Then you've got Medicine Jar, and that was a song by Jimmy McCullough and Colin Allan. It's a workmanlike song, but it's got some good guitars on it. It's got a good band performance. I think Jimmy does a decent vocal performance, and I guess it was Paul trying to bring the other band members into the spotlight a little bit, something he'd do on the next album. Call Me Back Again is probably a remake of Oh Darling from Abbey Road. It's got that kind of 1950s rock soul kind of sound to it. They're an absolutely brilliant vocal performance from McCartney. Real throat shredding stuff. The song is a little bit generic. It's not anything to write home about, but I think the arrangement and the vocal performance really carry it through. Listen to What the Man Said, the big hit single, you know, one of Wings' most joyous songs, really. Very upbeat, very positive, lovely tune. Tom Scott's wonderful saxophone. Really amazing to hear that Paul considered taking that song off the album or not including it because he didn't think it was really happening. I think if he'd done that, that would have been a major, major omission. I think the presence of that song on side 2 really lifts the album because it's, clearly a very strong piece of songwriting. And then the record ends rather strangely. You've got this sort of medley, Treat Her Gently, Lonely Old People, which apparently wasn't a medley. It was actually a through-composed song. Everybody always assumed, because it seems like there's 2 different songs going on that have been segued together, but apparently, according to the book, Paul did actually compose them as one song. Quite a moving song in a way, but also a little bit maudlin, all about old age. Treat her gently, treat her kind. She doesn't even know her own mind. Bit by bit, 2 lonely old people keeping the time of day. Here we sit, out of breath, and nobody asked us to play. Old people's home for the day. Nobody asked us to play. It's quite nice, and sometimes I do find it genuinely moving, but it's not. It's not 1985, which brought the curtain down in the most spectacular fashion possible on the end of Band on the Run. It's definitely not up there like that. And then, of course, the record ends with Paul's version of the Crossroads theme by Tony Hatch. Crossroads being a soap opera in the UK. And I think the link in Paul's mind was that Crossroads was a TV show that was really beloved of old people. I can vouch for that because my grandmother absolutely loved it. She watched it every day. Didn't mean anything to the American fans. They just heard this great guitar solo and this really great tune, but for British fans it was a bit of a cringe-worthy moment really, because Crossroads had always been a bit of a naff show. It was cheap, it was badly acted, it wasn't very good at all really. There was some raised eyebrows, and maybe the album didn't end in the most spectacular way possible. The reviews were mixed. The Enemy, I think it was, with the line, how do you tell an ex-Beatle that he's made a shitty album? Which did not please McCartney. I'll just quickly show you the press release. But I think at the time this was a very, very big album from McCartney. I think there was a kind of a sense of no expenses spared. You know, the publicity drive for it was huge. After the album came out, they did some dates in the UK, then went to Australia, and then after that there was the gradual build-up to the big American tour, you know, the Wings Over America tour, and lots of songs from Venus and Mars ended up being played on that tour and got onto the resulting live album, as I've mentioned already. And those versions, I would agree with John Heaton, those versions are more rocking. But I think I'm probably more of a fan of the studio versions than John is. I think the studio versions are different. They're not, you know, they're not as abrasive. They're not as exciting. But the production on this record overall, I don't mind it. There are some touches that I really like. I like the reverb on the drums, which is not something you hear too much of, really. Elton John did it a lot in his 1970s albums. He always had just a little touch of reverb on the drums, just gave them quite an exciting kind of sound. I do think Joe English is a tremendous drummer. I think it's a good band. I think there's some good performances, and the material sometimes not top drawer. And I think overall, I think Venus and Mars, I think there's two broad categories of McCartney albums. There's the albums which cross over into the kind of, you know, over time, they cross over into the mainstream world of musical appreciation. So, you know, you get albums like McCartney and Ram, Flaming Pie, certainly. You know, there's a sort of handful of McCartney albums. Band on the Run is the big one, which cross over. And then you get these other albums which always tend to just be liked by McCartney fans. You know, the Pipes of Peace and the... although I think Venus and Mars is a stronger album than Pipes of Peace, but that's kind of what I mean. I think over time this has turned into one of those records which you sort of have to be a bit of a McCartney nut to really love this record. And I do see it being dissed quite a bit, but it was never a big favourite of mine when I was growing up. Band on the Run, I'd always, you know, that completely swept me away. But when I heard Venus and Mars as a kid, it didn't really appeal to me. Later on I got the CD and got into it, and I've really, over time, I've really come to value this record and enjoy it. But I can see its imperfections, and I can see that it probably didn't, well, it certainly didn't, I don't think, rival or outdo Band on the Run, which is what it had been intended to do. He gave it his best shot, and some enjoyable work came out of it, and a fun album, which is still obviously in my collection, and one that I will always go back to, Venus and Mars. There we go. Hope you enjoyed that look at the album, and let me know what you think of it in the comments. And thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.